I sit in this sterile courtroom, staring across the aisle at my own parents with their sharp-suited attorney. And I cannot believe this is my reality. My mother, Susan, refuses to make eye contact, while my father, Richard, glares at me with a fury so cold it makes my hands shake. The lawsuit papers crumpled in my trembling grip state that my parents are suing me for fraudulent acquisition of family property. The modest three-bedroom ranch house I bought with my own hard-earned savings after 13 grueling years of working double shifts. The judge enters, black robes flowing, and I realize this single moment will either destroy my family forever or reveal buried truths that have festered in darkness for decades. Everything I believed about my life is about to shatter completely. 3 weeks ago, I stood on the front porch of 247 Maple Street, holding the keys to my very first home, and I swear, I felt like I could conquer the world. At 28 years old, I had finally done what seemed impossible since I was 15 and started my first job bagging groceries. Every dollar I earned working as a pharmacy technician during weekdays and doing landscaping on weekends went straight into my house fund. No fancy vacations, no expensive gadgets, no eating out unless it was someone's birthday. Just pure determination and sacrifice. The house was nothing spectacular by most standards, but to me, it represented everything. 1,200 square feet of freedom, a small backyard where I could plant tomatoes, and most importantly, it was mine. No more landlords raising rent every year, no more thin walls where I could hear neighbors arguing, no more living paycheck to paycheck, just to keep a roof over my head. I called my girlfriend Amanda that evening, practically bouncing with excitement as I walked through each room. She worked nights as a nurse at County General, so our schedules rarely lined up perfectly, but she listened patiently as I described the built-in bookshelves in the living room and the breakfast nook that got perfect morning sunlight. "Julian, I am so proud of you," she said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in her voice despite the exhaustion from her 12-hour shift. "You earned every square inch of that place." My best friend Marcus stopped by the next day with a 6-pack of beer and his toolkit. We had known each other since middle school, and he understood better than anyone what this house meant to me. Marcus worked construction and had been giving me advice throughout the house hunting process, warning me about foundation issues and electrical problems I never would have noticed. "Man, you did it," he said, clinking his bottle against mine as we sat on my new front steps. "Remember when we were 16, and you said you were going to own a house by 30? You beat your own deadline." That first week was pure bliss. I painted the bedroom a soft blue that reminded me of summer skies, installed new light fixtures, and spent hours just walking from room to room, marveling at the fact that I could hang pictures wherever I wanted without asking permission. Then my parents showed up. I was replacing the kitchen faucet when I heard their car in the driveway. Through the window, I watched Richard and Susan climbing out of their old Honda Civic, both wearing expressions I had never seen before. Not the usual mixture of pride and concern they showed when visiting my cramped apartment, but something harder and more calculating. "Julian, we need to talk," my father announced the moment I opened the front door. He pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the interior with an intensity that made my stomach clench. My mother followed silently, her lips pressed into a thin line. Susan had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made excuses when Richard's temper flared. But now, she looked almost cold. "Nice place," Richard said, but there was no warmth in his voice. "Must have cost you a pretty penny." $215,000, I replied, confused by his tone. "The mortgage payments are manageable with my current income, and I put down 20% like you always taught me." "Taught you?" Richard laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Julian, there are things about this house you do not understand. Things about our family history that we have never discussed." My mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "This house belongs to our family, Julian. You have made a terrible mistake." I felt like someone had just dumped ice water over my head. What are you talking about? This house has been on the market for months. I worked with a realtor, got a proper inspection, went through all the legal channels. Legal channels? Richard repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You think because some realtor took your money and handed you papers that makes it yours? Dad, you are scaring me. What is this about? This house rightfully belongs to us through inheritance. Susan said, her composure cracking slightly. Your grandparents owned this property decades ago, and we never relinquished our claim. I stared at them in complete bewilderment. My grandparents had died when I was very young, and my parents had always been vague about family history. We moved frequently during my childhood, always renting small apartments or cramped duplexes. I had assumed they simply preferred the flexibility of renting, or maybe they could not afford to buy. Why have you never mentioned this before? I asked, my voice rising. I have been house hunting for 2 years. You knew exactly what I was looking for and where I was searching. We thought the property would remain tied up in legal complications indefinitely, Richard said. We never imagined someone would actually be able to purchase it. You need to return what belongs to the family. Susan added, tears forming in her eyes. We cannot let this stand. Return it. I felt dizzy, like the floor was shifting beneath my feet. This is my home. I spent 13 years saving for this moment. Every overtime shift, every weekend spent pulling weeds in other people's gardens. I earned this. You earned nothing. Richard snapped, his mask of civility finally slipping. You bought stolen property, whether you realized it or not. They left without another word, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the tools I had been using to make this house truly mine, and felt everything I had worked for slipping away. That night, I could not sleep. I wandered through the empty rooms, touching the walls, as if they might disappear if I stopped paying attention. In the basement, where I planned to set up a small workshop, I noticed something strange. One of the baseboards was loose, probably damaged during the previous owner's move. When I pulled it away from the wall to examine the damage, a yellowed envelope fell out from behind it. My hands shook as I opened it carefully, revealing old property deeds and legal documents dating back to the 1970s. The papers were partially water-damaged and difficult to read, but one name appeared repeatedly throughout the faded text: Eleanor Hartley. Eleanor Hartley had been my grandmother's maiden name. I spent the entire night spread across my kitchen table, trying to decipher the water-stained documents with a magnifying glass I borrowed from my neighbor. The papers told a confusing story of property transfers, tax liens, and legal proceedings that made my head spin. But the core facts seemed clear. My grandparents had indeed owned this house, and they had lost it sometime in the late 1970s. What disturbed me most was not the discovery itself, but my parents' reaction when I confronted them the next morning. I drove to their apartment before dawn, clutching the envelope like evidence of a crime. Where did you get these? Richard demanded, his face pale as he flipped through the documents. They were hidden in the basement of my house, I said. Our house, apparently. Why have you never told me about any of this? Susan burst into tears and fled to their bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Richard stood frozen in their tiny living room, the papers trembling in his hands. This changes nothing, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Those documents prove our claim. You bought property that was stolen from our family. Then why are you upset? If these papers support your case, you should be celebrating. Richard did not answer. Instead, he set the documents on their coffee table and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot of their run-down apartment complex. You do not understand the complexity of the situation, he said. There are legal issues involved that require professional handling. What kind of legal issues, Dad? If you have a legitimate claim to this property, we can work something out. I do not want to fight with my family over this. It is too late for that. Richard's voice was flat, emotionless. I have already contacted an attorney. The next morning, I found Thomas Brennan's business card slipped under my door, along with a formal letter demanding I vacate the property within 30 days or face immediate litigation. The legal language was dense and intimidating, full of phrases like fraudulent conveyance and unjust enrichment that made my stomach churn. I called Amanda during my lunch break at the pharmacy, desperate for someone to tell me this was all some horrible misunderstanding. "Maybe they have a point," she said hesitantly. "I mean, if your grandparents really did own the house, and your parents never formally gave up their rights, you think I should just hand over my life savings and walk away? I think you need to be realistic about this situation. Fighting your own family in court could destroy relationships that can never be repaired." Her response felt like a betrayal, even though I knew she was trying to be practical. I had expected unconditional support, someone to be as outraged as I was about the injustice of the situation. Marcus had a completely different reaction when I showed him the documents that evening. We sat in his pickup truck outside a diner, spreading the papers across the dashboard, while he studied them with a contractor's attention to detail. "This is shady as hell," he said bluntly. "Look at these dates. Your grandparents lost the house in 1979, but there is a gap in the ownership records until 1985. What happened during those 6 years? I have no idea. The papers are too damaged to read clearly. We need to go to the county courthouse and look up the official records. There has to be more to this story." The next day, Marcus took time off work to accompany me to the courthouse. The clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, was incredibly patient as we requested decades of property records. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck. "This property has certainly had an interesting history," she said, pulling file after file from the archives. "I remember when it was tied up in probate court back in the 80s. Very complicated case." "What kind of complications?" I asked. "Well, I should not really discuss ongoing legal matters, but since this was so long ago..." She glanced around to make sure we were alone. The original foreclosure was questionable. There were allegations of improper notification and rushed proceedings. Marcus and I exchanged glances. "Do you remember any specific details?" "Not off the top of my head, but I can tell you who handled most of the property disputes from that era. Frank Morrison was the attorney who specialized in these cases. He retired about 10 years ago, but he might remember something useful." Mrs. Patterson provided Frank's contact information, and I called him that afternoon. His voice was gravelly, but sharp, and he agreed to meet with us the following evening to review the documents. Frank Morrison's home office was exactly what I expected from a retired lawyer: floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, an enormous oak desk, and the lingering smell of pipe tobacco. He was in his 70s, but moved with the energy of a much younger man. "This is fascinating," he said, studying the papers through a large magnifying glass. "I do remember this case, actually. Your grandparents got caught up in a very ugly situation." "What happened?" "They fell behind on property taxes during a difficult financial period. Your grandfather had health problems, I believe, and the medical bills were overwhelming. But they were working with the county to establish a payment plan." Frank continued reading, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. His expression grew increasingly troubled. "Here is the problem," he said finally. "Your grandparents did lose the house due to unpaid taxes, but the foreclosure sale was improperly conducted. The buyer never properly recorded the deed transfer with the county." "What does that mean?" "It means this house has been in legal limbo for over 40 years. Technically, it has had no clear legal owner since 1979. I felt the blood drain from my face. "So I bought a house that nobody actually owned." "Not exactly. The current seller had what we call color of title. They possessed the property and paid taxes on it, which gave them some legal standing. But your purchase is definitely vulnerable to challenge. And my parents have a legitimate claim." Frank removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes wearily. "That depends on several factors. If your grandparents' heirs never formally relinquished their rights, they might have a case. But there are also statutes of limitations to consider, and the fact that they waited over 40 years to assert their claim. They say they have been tracking the house for decades, waiting for the right moment to reclaim it. Frank's eyebrows shot up. Really? That would require some very sophisticated legal maneuvering and access to property records. As he spoke those words, a terrible thought began forming in my mind. My father had worked various part-time jobs over the years to supplement their income. One of those jobs I suddenly remembered was with the county assessor's office. "Mr. Morrison," I said slowly, "what if someone had been working for the county and had access to property records? Could they have been manipulating the system somehow?" Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "That would be a very serious allegation. Document tampering, fraud, abuse of public trust. If you have evidence of something like that, we are talking about potential criminal charges." But as I drove home that night, the pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. Richard had been working part-time for the county assessor's office for 12 years, giving him access to property records and the ability to track ownership changes. He would have known the exact legal status of the house and could have been planning this scheme for over a decade, waiting for someone naive enough to buy the property so he could swoop in with a legal challenge. My own father had been setting a trap, and I had walked right into it. The lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday morning, while I was at work measuring prescriptions and trying to maintain a facade of normalcy. My supervisor handed me the official court documents with a sympathetic expression, and I felt my knees go weak as I read the formal legal language demanding not just the house, but compensation for 45 years of lost rental income. "Take the rest of the day off," my supervisor said quietly. "Handle whatever you need to handle." By that afternoon, the story had somehow reached the local news. A reporter called my cell phone while I sat in Frank Morrison's office, asking for comment on the unusual family dispute that was garnering attention across the county. "Sun Sued by Parents Over Dream Home," read the headline on the evening broadcast. The reporter described it as a heartbreaking case of family greed versus the American dream. But seeing my personal tragedy turned into entertainment made me sick to my stomach. The media attention made everything worse. At work, my colleagues whispered behind my back, and I caught fragments of conversations speculating about whether I had known the house was disputed property. Amanda's family started asking pointed questions about my integrity, wondering aloud whether I had deliberately purchased stolen property to get a bargain. They are saying maybe you researched the property history and took advantage of the legal confusion, Amanda told me during one of our increasingly tense phone calls. "You honestly believe I would do something like that?" "I do not know what to believe anymore, Julian. This whole situation is so bizarre. Why would your parents sue you unless they had solid grounds?" The stress began affecting my job performance. I made mistakes filling prescriptions, mixed up patient files, and found myself unable to concentrate for more than a few minutes at a time. When my supervisor suggested I take unpaid leave until the situation resolved, I knew my career was in jeopardy, along with everything else. My sister Beth called me that night sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. "I am so sorry," she kept repeating. "Julian, I am so sorry. I did not know it would go this far." "What are you talking about?" "They asked me to help them. Mom and Dad said they needed to know about your house shopping because they wanted to surprise you with a housewarming gift. They had me drive by properties you were looking at and report back on which ones seemed serious." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. "You were spying on me." "I thought I was helping plan a surprise. They said they wanted to get you something special for your first home, maybe help with the down payment. I never imagined they were planning to sue you." Beth was 25, 2 years younger than me, and had always been the family peacekeeper. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office, and still lived with our parents contributing to household expenses, but never quite able to save enough to move out on her own. "When did you realize what they were really doing?" "About 2 weeks ago, when Dad started meeting with that lawyer. I overheard them talking about inheritance claims and fraudulent property transfers. Mom was crying and saying she did not want to hurt you, but Dad kept insisting they had no choice. "And you did not think to warn me." "I tried to convince them to talk to you directly, but Dad said it was too late for that. He claimed you would never voluntarily give up the house, so they had to use legal force." As Beth spoke, I realized the depth of my father's manipulation. He had been orchestrating this scheme for months, maybe years, using his own daughter as an unwitting accomplice, while positioning himself as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. Frank Morrison had been busy investigating the property records, and his findings were disturbing. Someone had indeed been systematically altering documents over the years, but proving it required expert analysis that was expensive and time-consuming. The good news is that I found Dorothy Chen at the city records office, Frank told me during one of our meetings. She has been working there for 15 years and has noticed discrepancies in some of the older files. Dorothy was a meticulous administrator in her 40s who took pride in maintaining accurate records. When Frank explained our situation, she immediately offered to help compare digital scans with the original paper documents stored in the basement archives. "This is very troubling," she said, spreading papers across a conference table in the city building. "Look at these property transfer dates. The digital records show different dates than the original paper documents." "How is that possible?" "Someone with system access could have altered the database entries over time, making subtle changes that would be difficult to detect unless you were specifically looking for discrepancies." Meanwhile, my relationship with Amanda was falling apart. The constant stress and uncertainty had created a wedge between us that seemed to widen every day. "I cannot build a future with someone whose past is so complicated and potentially criminal," she said during what turned out to be our final conversation. "I need stability, Julian. I need to know that the person I am with is not going to drag me into legal battles and family drama." "So you are abandoning me when I need support the most?" "I am protecting myself. You would do the same thing if you were in my position." Her words stung, because part of me understood her reasoning even as I felt betrayed by her timing. But the abandonment confirmed what I was learning about people under pressure. Some stand by you, and others reveal their true priorities when things get difficult. Richard and Susan hired Sterling Blackwood and Associates, a prestigious law firm that specialized in property rights and inheritance disputes. Their lead attorney was a sharp woman named Catherine Sterling, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics and minimal sympathy for opposing parties. The legal papers they filed painted me as a manipulative opportunist who had researched the property's troubled history and deliberately purchased it to exploit legal loopholes. They demanded not just the house, but compensation for decades of lost rental income, legal fees, and punitive damages for willful interference with inheritance rights. "Your son has committed fraud," Catherine Sterling announced during a pretrial conference. "He purchased property knowing full well that his grandparents' heirs had never relinquished their lawful claim." Frank countered by requesting access to all county employment records for Richard, hoping to establish his access to property databases and potential motive for the scheme. But the judge seemed reluctant to allow what he called a fishing expedition into irrelevant employment history. As I sat in these legal meetings watching attorneys argue about my life, like it was an abstract puzzle, I began to understand how completely outmatched I was. My parents had resources, professional representation, and a carefully constructed narrative that cast me as the villain of this story. The breaking point came when Frank showed me Eleanor's personal diary, which Beth had retrieved from storage boxes in our parents' basement. "Your grandmother kept detailed records of her final months," Frank said gently. "Julian, you need to prepare yourself for what you are about to read." The diary entries from 1979 revealed a heartbreaking story of an elderly woman trying to save her home, while her own son pressured her to sell. Eleanor wrote about Richard's gambling debts, his demands for money, and his anger when she refused to mortgage the house to pay for his losses. Richard came by again today, angrier than before. Read one entry dated 6 weeks before her death. He says, "I am being selfish, holding onto property when he needs cash immediately." but this house is all I have left of his father. I told him I would find a way to pay the back taxes myself, but he stormed out without listening. Another entry, written just days before Eleanor's fatal heart attack, was even more damning. I called the county office and arranged to pay the tax debt in installments. Richard does not know I have managed to save enough money. I want to surprise him by keeping the house in the family, but I worry he will just demand I sell it anyway to cover his gambling losses. My grandmother had been trying to save the house when she died, but Richard had apparently hidden her efforts and allowed the foreclosure to proceed. He had been willing to let his own mother lose her home to cover his gambling debts, and now he was claiming to be the victim of an injustice. The diary proved that Richard had been lying about preserving family heritage for decades. His real motivation was financial gain, and he had been planning this scheme since I was a teenager, waiting for the perfect opportunity to exploit the property's complicated legal status. Armed with Eleanor's diary and evidence of Richard's deception, I felt cautiously optimistic as Frank prepared our defense. But my father's legal team was not finished with their assault on my credibility and financial stability. Catherine Sterling filed aggressive motions challenging every piece of evidence we presented. She claimed the diary was potentially forged, the property records were irrelevant to the inheritance dispute, and my allegations of records tampering were desperate attempts to deflect from my own fraudulent behavior. Mr. Julian Hartley purchased property knowing it was subject to family inheritance claims, she argued during a pretrial hearing. His subsequent attempts to manufacture evidence of wrongdoing by his own father represent a disturbing escalation of his deceptive behavior. The legal fees were devastating. Frank worked for reduced rates, but expert witnesses' document authentication and court costs quickly depleted what remained of my savings. I took on a third job, delivering food for a restaurant delivery service, working from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. after my regular shifts at the pharmacy. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the emotional toll was worse. I was fighting a war against my own family, watching relationships dissolve, and my reputation crumble while struggling to maintain some semblance of normal life. Marcus became my strongest ally during this period, organizing a neighborhood fundraiser that raised several $1,000s for my legal expenses. The community response surprised me. Neighbors I barely knew contributed money and offered encouragement, creating a support network I had never expected. "This is about more than just your house," explained Janet Rodriguez, who lived 3 doors down and worked as a high school teacher. "It is about whether honest work and fair play mean anything in this country." The fundraiser became a small local movement, with people sharing stories about their own struggles to achieve homeownership and their outrage at seeing someone's family sabotage their American dream. Beth finally found the courage to move out of our parents' house, staying with me, despite the cramped conditions. She revealed more disturbing details about Richard and Susan's hidden assets and dishonest financial practices. "They have been lying about money for years," she told me one evening as we sorted through boxes of documents. "Dad has a secret savings account with almost $50,000, and Mom inherited jewelry from our aunt that they claimed was worthless costume pieces. Why would they hide assets? Because they want everyone to think they are struggling victims who never had opportunities. It makes their lawsuit against you look more sympathetic." Beth also confirmed my suspicions about Richard's access to county property records. He used to bring home printouts of property transfers and tax assessments. I thought it was just work paperwork, but now I realize he was researching specific properties for personal reasons. Meanwhile, Dorothy Chen's investigation into the altered records was yielding significant evidence. She discovered systematic discrepancies in dozens of property files, all showing signs of unauthorized database modifications during the period when Richard worked for the county assessor's office. "This represents a pattern of criminal activity, spanning more than a decade," she told Frank during one of their meetings. "Someone has been manipulating public records for personal gain, and the electronic trail points directly to specific user accounts and access times." But proving Richard's involvement required forensic computer analysis that was expensive and technically complex. The judge had granted our request for expert examination of the county database systems, but the process would take months and cost tens of thousands of dollars I did not have. Tyler Chen, Amanda's younger brother, reached out to me during this period with an unexpected offer. He worked in digital forensics for a private security company and felt guilty about his sister's abandonment of me during the crisis. I cannot testify as an expert witness because of conflict of interest, he explained, but I can analyze the diary's paper and ink composition to prove its authenticity. That work I can do pro bono. Tyler's analysis confirmed that Eleanor's diary was genuine, written with period-appropriate materials and ink formulations that matched other documents from 1979. The scientific authentication strengthened our case significantly and undermined Catherine Sterling's claims about forged evidence. The community support continued growing as local news stations picked up the story and began investigating other potentially fraudulent foreclosures from the 1970s and 80s. The narrative shifted from family dispute to government corruption and elder abuse, bringing unwanted scrutiny to Richard's activities and the county assessor's office. But my parents doubled down on their legal strategy, filing motions for expedited hearings and demanding immediate possession of the property. They claimed I was damaging the house's value through neglect and using media attention to prejudice potential jurors against their legitimate inheritance claim. Julian is conducting a campaign of character assassination against his own parents, Catherine Sterling told reporters outside the courthouse. He would rather destroy his family than admit he made a mistake. The psychological pressure was intense. I began having trouble sleeping, lost weight from stress and overwork, and found myself questioning whether the fight was worth destroying what remained of my family relationships. One particularly low moment came when I discovered Amanda had started dating someone new, a doctor from her hospital who could offer her the stability and drama-free life she wanted. Seeing them together at a restaurant while I was delivering food felt like a physical blow, confirmation that my life had become too chaotic for normal relationships. I seriously considered accepting whatever settlement my parents offered, even though it would mean financial ruin and the loss of everything I had worked for. The thought of giving up felt like failure, but continuing the fight seemed impossible. Frank sensed my despair and arranged a meeting to discuss our options realistically. "Julian, you need to understand something important," he said. "This case is not just about your house anymore. It is about accountability for fraud and abuse of public trust. If Richard has been manipulating property records for decades, other families have likely been victimized. But I cannot afford to keep fighting. That is why I contacted the district attorney's office yesterday. They are interested in opening a criminal investigation into Richard's activities. If they find evidence of fraud, it could completely change the dynamics of your civil case." The night before our next court hearing, Frank received an unexpected phone call from Thomas Brennan, my parents' original attorney, who had withdrawn from the case under mysterious circumstances. "He wants to meet with us privately," Frank told me. Brennan says he discovered his clients lied to him about crucial facts, and he is ethically bound to withdraw unless they correct the record. "What kind of lies?" He would not say over the phone, but he hinted that Richard has been hiding evidence that would completely vindicate you. Brennan suggested we subpoena specific bank records and insurance documents that Richard claimed were destroyed years ago. As I prepared for what felt like the final battle, I realized this experience had taught me harsh lessons about family loyalty and the price of standing up for truth. Win or lose, I would never be the same person who naively believed blood relationships guaranteed love and support. The real question was whether justice existed for ordinary people fighting against those with resources, connections, and willingness to exploit family bonds for personal gain. The revelation about Thomas Brennan's hidden evidence gave us new hope, but Frank warned me that courtroom victories were never guaranteed, especially when family relationships complicated the legal issues. Brennan is taking a significant risk by reaching out to us. Frank explained as we prepared for the secret meeting. Attorneys have strict ethical obligations about client confidentiality, but they also cannot participate in fraud. We met Brennan at a coffee shop outside town, far from the courthouse and legal district, where we might be recognized. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and tired eyes that suggested he had been wrestling with difficult decisions. "I need to be very careful about what I say." Brennan began glancing around nervously. "But I can tell you that your parents misrepresented crucial facts about their financial situation and their knowledge of the property's history." "What kind of misrepresentations?" "They claimed they had been financially devastated by the loss of the house and had spent decades trying unsuccessfully to reclaim it through proper legal channels. But when I requested supporting documentation for our case, they became evasive and hostile." Brennan pulled out a manila folder containing copies of documents he had gathered before withdrawing from the case. Richard finally admitted that he received a substantial insurance payout after his mother's death money that could have easily covered the property tax debt. He also revealed that he had been tracking the house's ownership status for years through his county job. So he knew exactly when someone would be able to purchase it. More than that, he had been waiting for a buyer naive enough to go through normal real estate channels without researching the property's complicated legal history. When you bought the house, he saw an opportunity to claim both the property and substantial damages. Frank studied the documents carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This suggests a level of premeditation that goes far beyond a simple inheritance dispute," he said. "Richard has been planning this scheme for years, positioning himself to exploit his own son's dreams of home ownership." "There is something else," Brennan continued. "When I pressed them about their true financial situation, Susan broke down and admitted she never wanted to sue Julian. She said Richard threatened to leave her penniless if she did not support the lawsuit." The meeting lasted 2 hours, with Brennan providing detailed information about the documents we should subpoena and the questions we should ask during depositions. By the time we parted ways, our strategy had completely changed from defensive to offensive. But the new evidence also meant facing even more painful truths about my family. Richard had not only been willing to exploit his son's hard work for personal gain, but he had been manipulating and threatening my mother for years to ensure her compliance. Beth was devastated when I shared Brennan's revelations with her that evening. I knew Dad could be controlling, but I never imagined he was capable of something this calculated and cruel. She said, tears streaming down her face. "Mom has been trapped in this situation, probably afraid to oppose him. We have to focus on proving the truth in court." I replied, though my own emotions were raw and confused. "Whatever happens to our family relationships, we cannot let him get away with fraud." The days leading up to trial were a whirlwind of preparation. Frank subpoenaed Richard's bank records, insurance documents, and county employment files. Dorothy Chen provided detailed reports about the altered property records, and Tyler completed his authentication of Eleanor's diary. But Catherine Sterling was not backing down. She filed motions to exclude most of our evidence, claiming it was irrelevant to the simple question of inheritance rights. She argued that regardless of Richard's past mistakes or current motivations, the legal claim to the property remained valid. The plaintiff's attempts to vilify their clients cannot change the fundamental facts, she stated in legal briefs. Eleanor Hartley's heirs never formally relinquished their rights to the property, and Julian Hartley purchased it without clear title. The community support continued growing as trial approached. Local news stations aired investigative reports about questionable foreclosure practices from the 1970s and 80s, with my case serving as a symbol of government corruption and family greed. Janet Rodriguez organized a letter-writing campaign to the district attorney's office, demanding criminal investigation of Richard's activities. The pressure was building from multiple directions, but I knew that public sympathy would not necessarily translate to legal victory. Marcus took vacation time to attend the trial, joining Beth and dozens of neighbors who wanted to show support. The courthouse was packed with reporters, community members, and other families who had discovered similar problems with their property histories. "Whatever happens in there, you have fought for what is right," Marcus told me as we walked up the courthouse steps. "That matters more than any house." Susan approached me in the hallway before proceedings began, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she had aged years in the past few months. "Julian, I want you to know that I never wanted any of this," she whispered, glancing around to make sure Richard was not within earshot. "I tried to talk him out of the lawsuit, but he said we had no choice." "Mom, you always have choices. You could have warned me or refused to participate. You do not understand what he is like when he does not get his way. I have been walking on eggshells for 20 years trying to keep peace in our house." Her words broke my heart, even as they confirmed my suspicions about the dynamics in my parents' marriage. Susan had been as much a victim of Richard's manipulation as I was trapped by fear and financial dependence. "If you testify honestly about what really happened, it could help both of us," I said gently. "I cannot betray him, Julian. He is still my husband. And I am your son." Susan's tears fell freely as she walked away, leaving me to understand that she would choose the familiar prison of her marriage over the uncertain freedom of telling the truth. The trial began with Catherine Sterling's opening statement, portraying my parents as elderly victims whose rightful inheritance had been stolen by their ungrateful son. She painted a picture of Richard and Susan struggling for decades to reclaim family property, while I selfishly pursued my own interests. Frank's opening was more measured, but equally powerful. He promised to prove that Richard had orchestrated an elaborate fraud, manipulating both his family and public records to steal his son's life savings and destroy his dreams of homeownership. "This case is about more than property disputes," Frank told the jury. "It is about whether we will allow government employees to abuse their positions for personal gain, and whether families can be torn apart by greed disguised as righteous indignation." As testimony began, I realized that whatever the outcome, this trial would change everything about my understanding of family justice and the price of fighting for what is right. The first witness was Dorothy Chen, who methodically explained the evidence of altered property records and database manipulation. Her testimony was technical, but damning, showing a clear pattern of unauthorized changes to official documents. Catherine Sterling tried to discredit Dorothy's findings by suggesting that computer glitches or innocent data entry errors could explain the discrepancies, but her cross-examination only highlighted the systematic nature of the alterations. Tyler's testimony about the diary authentication was similarly effective, providing scientific proof that Eleanor's writings were genuine and had not been fabricated to support my case. But the real drama began when Richard took the witness stand, and Frank began questioning him about his county employment, his gambling history, and his knowledge of the house's legal status. The courtroom was about to witness the complete collapse of my father's carefully constructed lies. Richard walked to the witness stand with the confident bearing of a man who believed his performance had been rehearsed to perfection. He wore his best suit and had gotten a fresh haircut, clearly understanding that his appearance would matter as much as his words. Catherine Sterling's direct examination was smooth and sympathetic. Richard testified that he had spent decades researching his family's property rights, working within the legal system to understand complex inheritance laws. He portrayed himself as a patient man who had waited for the proper opportunity to reclaim stolen family heritage. "We never imagined Julian would unknowingly purchase our family property," he said, his voice filled with apparent sadness. "When we discovered what had happened, we tried to resolve the matter privately, but he refused to acknowledge our legitimate claims." "And how did this situation affect your family relationships?" Sterling prompted. "It has been devastating. No parent wants to take legal action against their child, but we cannot allow fraud to stand unchallenged even when it involves someone we love." Richard's performance was polished and compelling. He appeared to be a reluctant plaintiff, forced into an unfortunate situation by his son's stubbornness and legal naivety. Then, Frank Morrison stood up for cross-examination. "Mr. Hartley, You testified that you spent decades researching your family's property rights. Is it true that you have worked part-time for the county assessor's office for the past 12 years? Yes, but that job was completely unrelated to this property dispute. Really? What were your specific duties at the assessor's office? Richard shifted uncomfortably. General administrative work, filing documents, data entry. Data entry into the property records database. Among other duties, yes. Frank approached the witness stand, carrying a thick folder of documents. Mr. Hartley, I am showing you county employment records indicating that your user account accessed the property file for 247 Maple Street over 200 times during your employment period. Can you explain why you were so interested in this particular property? The courtroom fell silent. Richard's confident demeanor cracked slightly as he struggled to formulate an answer. I may have checked on the property occasionally to monitor its status for potential family claims. 200 times over 12 years represents more than occasional monitoring, does it not? I do not recall the exact frequency of my research. Frank produced another document. These access logs show you downloaded and modified property transfer records for 247 Maple Street on 17 different occasions. What modifications were you making? Catherine Sterling objected, claiming the technical details were beyond Richard's expertise. But the judge allowed Frank to continue his questioning. I was not modifying anything, Richard insisted. I may have updated formatting or corrected clerical errors, but that was part of my normal job duties. Mr. Hartley, were you aware that altering public records for personal benefit constitutes fraud and abuse of public trust? I never altered anything for personal benefit. Frank's cross-examination continued, methodically exposing contradictions in Richard's testimony and revealing the depth of his access to confidential property information. By the time Frank finished, Richard appeared shaken and defensive. But the real bombshell came when Frank called Susan to testify. My mother walked to the witness stand slowly, her hands trembling, as she placed them on the Bible for swearing in. She avoided eye contact with everyone, including Richard, who was watching her with obvious tension. Frank's questioning was gentle, but pointed. Mrs. Hartley, did you want to file this lawsuit against your son? Susan's voice was barely audible. No, I did not. Can you tell the court why you ultimately agreed to participate? My husband said we had no choice. He said Julian had stolen from our family, and we had to fight back. Did you have personal knowledge of any theft or fraud committed by your son? No. Julian worked very hard to buy his house. I was proud of him. Then why did you agree to sue him? Susan finally looked directly at Richard, and something in her expression suggested a dam was about to burst. Because Richard threatened to leave me if I did not support him. He said I was either with the family or against it, and if I chose Julian over him, I would be on my own with nothing. The courtroom erupted. Catherine Sterling objected frantically, while Richard's face turned red with anger. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Mrs. Hartley, Frank continued when quiet was restored, do you have any evidence that your son acted fraudulently in purchasing his home? No. He was honest about everything. He saved his money and worked multiple jobs to afford that house. Do you believe this lawsuit is justified? Susan broke down, completely sobbing as she spoke. No, I think it is wrong. Julian earned that house, and we are trying to steal it from him because Richard wants money for his gambling debts. Objection! Catherine Sterling shouted, but it was too late. What gambling debts? Frank asked. Richard has been gambling online for years. He lost our savings and has been looking for ways to get money ever since. When he realized Julian had bought the family property, he saw an opportunity to solve our financial problems. The courtroom was in chaos. Catherine Sterling demanded a mistrial while Richard appeared ready to leap from his seat. The judge called a brief recess to restore order. During the break, I saw Susan in the hallway surrounded by supporters who offered her tissues and encouragement. She looked exhausted, but also relieved, as if a tremendous burden had been lifted from her shoulders. "I am sorry I waited so long to tell the truth," she said to me. "I was afraid of what would happen if I opposed him." "You did the right thing, Mom." When proceedings resumed, Frank had one final surprise. He called Thomas Brennan to testify about the documents Richard had hidden from his original attorney. Brennan's testimony was devastating. He revealed that Richard possessed insurance documents, proving he had received over $70,000 after Eleanor's death money, that could have easily saved the family property. He also testified about Richard's admission that he had been tracking the house through his county job, waiting for an opportunity to exploit its complicated legal status. "My client deliberately misled me about crucial facts," Brennan testified. "When I discovered the extent of his deception, I was ethically obligated to withdraw from representation." The final blow came when Frank played a secret recording Susan had made on her phone. Richard's voice filled the courtroom as he explained his scheme to a friend. "I have been planning this for 15 years, Richard's recorded voice said. "Julian does not know it, but I have been watching that house waiting for someone stupid enough to buy it through normal channels. When he finally did, I knew I could take everything he worked for and claim it was rightfully mine all along. The kid will be devastated, but he will get over it. Family property belongs to family, and I am going to make sure we finally cash in on the old man's investment." The recording played for nearly 10 minutes, with Richard describing his manipulation of property records, his threats against Susan, and his complete lack of remorse about destroying his son's dreams for financial gain. When the recording ended, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I had known my father was capable of selfishness and manipulation, but hearing him casually discuss ruining my life was more devastating than any legal defeat could have been. Catherine Sterling attempted damage control during closing arguments, claiming the recording was taken out of context, and that Richard's methods did not invalidate his client's legitimate inheritance rights. But her arguments fell flat against the overwhelming evidence of fraud and family manipulation. Frank's closing was passionate and personal. "Julian Hartley represents everything good about the American dream," he told the jury. "He worked honestly for 13 years, saved every dollar he could, and bought a modest home through legitimate channels. His own father saw that achievement as an opportunity for theft and spent years planning to destroy his son's future for personal gain." As the jury retired to deliberate, I sat with Marcus Beth and Susan watching Richard huddle with his lawyers at the far end of the courtroom. He looked older and smaller than I remembered, diminished by the exposure of his true character. "Do you think we won?" Beth asked quietly. "I think the truth finally came out," I replied. "Whatever the jury decides, at least everyone knows what really happened here." But deep in my heart, I believed justice would prevail. The evidence was overwhelming, the witness testimony was compelling, and 12 ordinary citizens had seen the same pattern of manipulation and fraud that had nearly destroyed my life. The question was not whether we would win, but how complete our victory would be, and whether my family could ever recover from the wounds Richard had inflicted on all of us. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. As the foreman stood to read their decision, the packed courtroom fell into absolute silence. "We find in favor of the defendant, Julian Hartley, on all counts," he announced. "We further find that the plaintiff's claims were brought in bad faith and recommend the court award attorney fees and court costs to the defendant." The relief hit me like a physical wave, and I had to grip the table to keep from collapsing. Beth grabbed my hand while Marcus clapped my shoulder, and even Frank Morrison allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. But Judge Patricia Williams was not finished. She asked both legal teams to remain as she prepared additional remarks. "In 30 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a clear case of fraud and family manipulation," she said, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "Richard Hartley orchestrated a scheme that involved abuse of public trust, manipulation of government records, and the deliberate destruction of his own son's dreams for financial gain." She turned to address Richard directly. Mr. Hartley, you have violated your oath as a county employee, betrayed your family's trust, and perverted the legal system for personal enrichment. I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation, and I am ordering you to pay Julian's legal fees and court costs in the amount of $68,000. Richard's face went ashen as the implications sank in. Not only had he lost the lawsuit, but he faced potential criminal charges and financial ruin from the court's judgment against him. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting you from contacting your son or approaching his property. Your actions constitute harassment and intimidation that cannot be tolerated in a civilized society. The courtroom erupted in applause, and I felt tears streaming down my face as neighbors and supporters celebrated the victory. But even in that moment of triumph, I felt sad about the complete destruction of my relationship with my father. Susan approached me as people began filing out of the courtroom, her own tears mixing relief with profound sadness. Julian, I am filing for divorce, she said quietly. I should have done it years ago, but I was afraid of being alone. This whole experience has shown me that being alone is better than being with someone who would destroy his own family for money. Mom, you know you can count on my support during the divorce proceedings. I do not deserve your forgiveness after what I put you through. You were a victim too, I said, meaning it completely. Richard manipulated both of us, but you found the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. The media coverage of our victory was extensive, with local news stations describing it as a triumph of justice over family greed. The story resonated with viewers across the country who saw parallels to their own struggles with family dynamics and achieving the American dream. More importantly, the case sparked investigations into other potentially fraudulent property dealings from the same era. The District Attorney's Office announced a task force to review questionable foreclosures and examine whether other county employees had abused their positions for personal gain. Dorothy Chen was promoted to head the new Records Integrity Division, tasked with implementing safeguards to prevent future manipulation of public documents. Her work on my case had revealed systematic vulnerabilities that affected hundreds of property owners across the county. 3 weeks after the trial, criminal charges were filed against Richard for fraud, abuse of public trust, and manipulation of public records. He ultimately pled guilty to avoid a lengthy prison sentence, receiving 3 years of probation and substantial financial penalties. But the real healing began in my personal relationships. Beth decided to use the experience as motivation to pursue paralegal training, inspired by witnessing Frank Morrison's dedication to justice. I offered to help pay for her education, grateful for her courage in standing up to our father. I want to help people who get caught up in legal situations they do not understand, she told me. This experience taught me how important it is to have someone fighting for you when the system seems overwhelming. Marcus's construction business benefited from the positive publicity surrounding his loyalty during my crisis. New clients specifically sought him out because they valued character and integrity over the lowest bid. Turns out being a good friend is also good for business. He joked, though I knew his support had nothing to do with calculating personal benefit. My romantic life took longer to rebuild. Amanda reached out after the trial to congratulate me and express regret about abandoning me during the crisis, but I politely declined her suggestion to reconnect. I learned something important about relationships during this experience, I told her. I need someone who stands by me during difficult times, not just during good times. 6 months later, I met Sarah Martinez at a community meeting about property rights reform. She was a third-grade teacher who had attended the meetings to support a neighbor dealing with a boundary dispute. Her genuine concern for others and quiet strength reminded me that good people do exist even after experiencing profound betrayal. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on shared values and mutual respect, rather than just physical attraction. Sarah appreciated the resilience I had developed during my legal battle, while I admired her dedication to helping children succeed, despite challenging circumstances. "You have been through something that would break most people," she told me one evening as we sat on my front porch. "But instead of becoming bitter, you became stronger and more compassionate." Susan's divorce proceedings were difficult, but ultimately liberating. Richard fought her for every asset, continuing his pattern of manipulation and control, even as his own legal troubles mounted. But with Beth's support and good legal representation, Susan managed to secure a fair settlement that allowed her to start fresh. She found a small apartment near my house and began working part-time at a local bookstore, rediscovering interests and friendships that had been suppressed during her marriage. Watching her transformation from fearful victim to independent woman was one of the most rewarding aspects of our victory. "I forgot what it felt like to make my own decisions," she told me during one of our weekly dinners together. "Richard controlled everything for so long that I had stopped thinking of myself as a separate person." The house at 247 Maple Street became more than just my home. It became a symbol of perseverance and the importance of fighting for what is right. I turned the basement into a workshop where Marcus and I restored furniture for families who could not afford new pieces, finding satisfaction in creating something beautiful from damaged materials. The neighborhood rallied around me in ways I never expected. Janet Rodriguez organized a housewarming party that drew over 50 people, creating connections and friendships that enriched my life far beyond the legal victory. "You gave all of us hope," she explained. "When we saw you fighting against such overwhelming odds and refusing to give up, it reminded us that ordinary people can still win against power and corruption." A year after the trial, I hosted a barbecue in my backyard to celebrate the anniversary of the court decision. Susan Beth Marcus, Sarah Frank Morrison, Dorothy Chen, and dozens of neighbors gathered to share food and stories. Standing in my kitchen watching people laugh and connect throughout my home, I reflected on how profoundly the experience had changed me. The young man who had nervously signed mortgage papers 18 months earlier had been naive about family loyalty and the nature of justice. The person I had become understood that real family is defined by love and support, not blood relationships. I had learned that fighting for truth requires courage and sacrifice, but the rewards extend far beyond personal victory. Most importantly, I realized that my 13-year journey to homeownership had taught me more than just persistence and financial discipline. It had prepared me to recognize my own strength and integrity when they were tested under the most difficult circumstances. As the evening wound down and guests began leaving, Sarah helped me clean up, while Beth and Susan organized leftovers for neighbors to take home. "Are you happy with how everything turned out?" Sarah asked, as we loaded the dishwasher together. I looked around my kitchen filled with evidence of genuine friendship and authentic relationships, and thought about how different my life was from the lonely victory I had once imagined. "I am more than happy," I replied. "I am grateful. This whole experience taught me what really matters: integrity, authentic relationships, and the courage to fight for what is right." The house at 247 Maple Street was finally truly mine. But more than that, I had built a life foundation based on truth, hard work, and the kind of relationships that survive any storm. Richard never attempted to contact me after his conviction, and I felt no need to seek reconciliation with someone who had been willing to destroy his family for money. Some bridges are better left burned when crossing them would compromise your integrity. But I held on to hope that someday he might recognize the damage he had caused and find a way to make amends, not for my benefit, but for his own peace of mind. Standing in my backyard that night, watching the last guests drive away, while Sarah and I planned our next weekend together, I understood that the best revenge against those who try to steal your dreams is living those dreams fully and authentically. The boy who had started saving for a house at age 15 had finally become the man who deserved to own one. Have you ever had to fight against your own family to protect something you worked hard to achieve? How do you balance loyalty to relatives with standing up for what is right when those two values come into conflict? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to help others find it. Subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming adversity, and share this video with anyone who might need encouragement to fight for their dreams. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that your integrity is worth more than any relationship that requires you to compromise it. Until next time, keep building the life you deserve, one honest decision at a time.